Dearest listeners, it has long been observed that the most remarkable transformations occur not in drawing rooms filled with admirers, but in the quiet corners where broken souls dare to hope again. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of a governess whose tears watered the seeds of a rake's redemption. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest Madeira, must be savored properly. The November rain of 1814 drummed against the windows of Thornfield Manor with the persistence of an unwelcome caller, each droplet seeming to echo the melancholy that had settled over the great house like morning mist upon the Yorkshire moors. Within the confines of the nursery, situated in the east wing where propriety dictated such domestic arrangements, Miss Arabella Fairfax bent over her charge's Latin primers with the dedicated attention of one who understood that survival itself depended upon the successful completion of such mundane tasks. At 23, Arabella possessed the sort of quiet beauty that might have graced drawing rooms in more fortunate circumstances. Her auburn hair, though simply dressed in the manner befitting her station, caught the lamplight with threads of gold that whispered of better days when such tresses had been adorned with ribbons rather than hidden beneath the plain caps required of governesses. Her gray eyes, large and expressive, held depths of intelligence that her current circumstances forced her to disguise behind the deferential manner expected of those who earned their bread through the instruction of other people's children. The transformation from Miss Fairfax of Fairfax Rectory to Miss Fairfax the governess had been as swift as it was devastating. 6 months prior, her father, the Reverend Thomas Fairfax, had succumbed to the lung fever that plagued him through the particularly harsh winter. With his passing, Arabella discovered that the comfortable life she had known existed solely through the church's beneficence, and that beneficence died with its recipient. The new rector, a married man with 6 children of his own, required the rectory for his growing family, leaving Arabella with little more than her accomplishments and a fierce determination not to burden the parish with her care. Her education, which had once been a source of pride, became her salvation. The daughter of a learned clergyman, she spoke French with the fluency of a native, could play the pianoforte with considerable skill, possessed a thorough knowledge of history and literature, and could sketch with an artistic eye that had once brought compliments from the local gentry. These accomplishments, combined with her gentle birth and unquestionable moral character, had secured her current position with Mrs. Caroline Thornfield, the widowed mother of the notorious Lord Sebastian Thornfield. Mrs. Thornfield, a lady of perhaps 50 years whose auburn hair suggested the source of her son's coloring, had interviewed Arabella with the sharp intelligence that seemed to run in the family bloodline. The older woman's gray eyes, so similar to those that now studied Latin conjugations, had assessed the young woman before her with an astuteness that suggested she understood exactly what desperation had driven a rector's daughter to seek employment. The circumstances surrounding Thornfield Manor had been whispered throughout Yorkshire and beyond. Lord Sebastian Thornfield, the current master of the estate, had returned from the Peninsular Wars 2 years prior, bearing more than physical scars from his service to crown and country. Where once he had been known as a young man of promise, intelligent, handsome, and possessed of all the advantages that birth and wealth could bestow, he had emerged from the conflict as something altogether different. The tales that preceded his reputation spoke of excesses that would have been remarkable even among the most dedicated rakes of London society. Gaming tables knew his presence with unwelcome regularity, bottles of brandy disappeared with alarming frequency, and his association with women of questionable virtue had become the stuff of local scandal. Most damaging of all, perhaps, was the duel he had fought with Lord Pemberton over some perceived slight related to Lady Pemberton's honor, a duel that had left Pemberton with a permanently disabled arm, and Thornfield with a reputation that no respectable family would willingly embrace. Mrs. Thornfield had made no attempt to disguise these realities during their interview. Her son, she admitted with the weary honesty of a mother who had exhausted her capacity for pretty euphemisms, was not the man he once was. The war had changed him, and not for the better. However, young Timothy was innocent of his father's sins, and she remained determined that the boy should not suffer for them. This house had seen enough sorrow. Indeed, sorrow seemed woven into the very fabric of Thornfield Manor. Timothy's mother, Sebastian's young wife, Lady Catherine, had died in childbed, leaving behind an infant son and a husband who had loved her with the passionate devotion of youth. Her death, occurring while Sebastian served with Wellington in Spain, had reached him only weeks after the fact, compounding the grief with the cruel knowledge that he had been absent during his beloved's final hours. Now, as Arabella guided Timothy through his lessons, she often caught glimpses of the man who ruled this troubled household. Lord Sebastian Thornfield moved through the manor like a wraith, appearing at odd hours with clothes disheveled and eyes bearing the telltale signs of another sleepless night spent in pursuit of forgetfulness. At 29, he retained the classical features that had once made him the darling of London's drawing rooms. Dark auburn hair refused to behave despite his valet's best efforts. Deep green eyes might have been striking if they were not so often clouded with either drink or exhaustion, and the sort of athletic build that suggested regular physical activity, though in his case that activity seemed more likely to involve boxing at Gentleman Jackson's than the genteel pursuits favored by his peers. Their paths within the house crossed only rarely, and when they did, the encounters were marked by the sort of stilted courtesy that acknowledged their vast differences in station while maintaining the proper distance required by convention. He was unfailingly polite, addressing her with the same formal courtesy he might show any respectable woman. But there was a distance in his manner that spoke of a man who had withdrawn from meaningful human connection. Timothy, however, spoke of his father with the uncomplicated adoration of a child who saw past the flaws that troubled the adult world. The boy would tell Arabella during their afternoon walks through the estate's extensive grounds that his papa knew everything about horses and could ride faster than anyone in Yorkshire. His grandmother had told him that his father was very brave in the war and fought against Bonaparte himself. These innocent observations painted a picture of complexity that intrigued Arabella despite her determination to maintain professional boundaries. The servants, with whom she occupied that peculiar middle ground between family and staff, spoke of their master with a mixture of loyalty and concern that suggested the man beneath the scandalous reputation inspired genuine affection from those who knew him best. Mrs. Palmer, the housekeeper, had confided during one of Arabella's early weeks at the manor that his lordship had not always been thus. Sweet as summer rain he had been as a lad, and devoted to his dear mother and his lady wife. The war had taken something from him, something that drink and gaming could not restore, though the poor soul tried. As autumn deepened into winter, Arabella settled into the rhythms of life at Thornfield Manor. Her days were structured around Timothy's needs: lessons in the morning, walks or outdoor activities when weather permitted, and quiet reading or drawing in the evenings. She took her meals in the small sitting room adjacent to the nursery, maintaining the social boundaries that separated her from both the family's dining room and the servants' hall below stairs. The isolation of her position might have been unbearable were it not for Mrs. Thornfield's kindness and Timothy's natural sweetness. The older woman often invited Arabella to join her for tea in the afternoon, conversations that ranged from Timothy's progress to discussions of books and current events that reminded Arabella of the intellectual companionship she had enjoyed with her father. Mrs. Thornfield observed one gray December afternoon, as they sat before the fire in her private sitting room, that Arabella had brought a calmness to the house that had been much needed. Timothy had not experienced nightmares since her arrival, and his studies had improved considerably. Arabella replied with appropriate modesty that the boy was naturally bright and required only patience and consistent guidance. Mrs. Thornfield acknowledged this assessment, but noted with a sadness that spoke of deeper concerns that such qualities had been in short supply within these walls. She confessed that she had hoped Arabella's presence might have additional benefits beyond Timothy's education. The meaning behind this observation was clear enough, though propriety prevented its direct expression. The hope that a virtuous young woman might somehow inspire Sebastian toward better behavior was one that Arabella understood but could not encourage. Her position was precarious enough without entertaining romantic fantasies about her employer, no matter how tragic his circumstances or how occasionally she glimpsed moments of the man he might have been. Winter at Thornfield Manor possessed a beauty that softened even its melancholy atmosphere. Snow blanketed the Yorkshire landscape in pristine silence, transforming the estate's gardens into a wonderland that delighted Timothy and provided Arabella with subjects for the sketching that filled her quiet evening hours. The manor itself, though shadowed by its current troubles, bore the marks of generations of care and cultivation. Fine furniture, excellent paintings, and a library that spoke of family members who had valued learning and culture. It was during these peaceful winter months that Arabella began to understand the true scope of Sebastian's transformation. The man who appeared so rarely in the family areas of the house was, she learned from observation and careful listening, consumed by a restlessness that drove him to seek distraction in increasingly destructive pursuits. The sound of his horse's hooves on the gravel drive at all hours became a familiar accompaniment to the winter nights, announcing his return from whatever diversions London or the local market towns provided. Yet there were moments, brief and almost accidental encounters, when Arabella glimpsed something different in the master of Thornfield Manor. Once, when Timothy had fallen and scraped his knee during a winter walk, Sebastian had appeared as if summoned by his son's cries, gathering the boy with a gentleness that spoke of deep paternal love. Another time, she had discovered him in the library late one evening, surrounded by books and papers, his appearance suggesting hours of serious study rather than the dissipation that occupied his usual evening hours. These glimpses served only to deepen the mystery of Lord Sebastian Thornfield, creating questions that propriety and prudence warned her not to pursue. Her position at Thornfield Manor provided security and purpose that she could not afford to jeopardize, no matter how her natural compassion might be stirred by the evidence of a soul in torment. As winter gave way to early spring, Arabella had established herself as an indispensable member of the household, earning the respect of the servants and the genuine affection of Mrs. Thornfield and Timothy. Her small salary was carefully saved against an uncertain future, and her skills as an educator were expanding Timothy's knowledge in ways that brought satisfaction to her professional pride. Yet beneath this surface contentment lay an awareness that her comfortable situation existed in a precarious balance. Sebastian's increasing wildness had begun to attract attention from creditors and concerned family members alike, and whispers suggested that even the considerable Thornfield fortune might not withstand indefinite assault from gambling debts and extravagant living. The morning of April the 15th dawned with the sort of crystalline clarity that seemed to promise that winter had finally released its grip upon Yorkshire. Arabella woke to discover that the persistent rain which had confined the household for nearly a week had given way to sunshine so brilliant it transformed the library windows into sheets of golden light. Timothy, recovered from the slight cold that had kept him indoors, appeared at her bedside with the irrepressible energy of a 7-year-old boy who had been denied outdoor adventure for far too long. His green eyes, so like his father's, bright with anticipation as he pleaded for permission to visit the lake that day. The daffodils would be blooming, he insisted, and perhaps they might see the family of swans that had nested there the previous summer. Arabella, who had been equally confined by the weather and felt her own spirits lifting at the prospect of fresh air and exercise, readily agreed to the expedition. After ensuring that Timothy was properly dressed for the potentially treacherous footing that spring weather could provide, she gathered their sketching materials and a small basket for any botanical specimens they might discover, and they set off toward the lake that lay perhaps a mile from the main house through Thornfield's extensive grounds. The path wound through gardens that bore the unmistakable signs of expert planning and care, despite their current air of gentle neglect. Box hedges, though in need of trimming, still maintained their essential shapes, while flower beds showed the early green shoots of bulbs planted by more hopeful hands in seasons past. The very beauty of the place, touched as it was with melancholy, seemed to echo the house itself. Noble bones beneath a surface that spoke of attention withdrawn and care suspended. Timothy chattered cheerfully as they walked, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of adventures he had enjoyed in these gardens during happier times when his mother had been alive and his father had taken regular pleasure in the estate's natural beauties. His innocent revelations painted pictures of family life that made Arabella's heart ache for all that had been lost. He described picnics by the lake where Lady Catherine had read poetry aloud, while Sebastian dozed in the afternoon sun. Morning rides through the park where father and son had raced their ponies with competitive good humor. Evenings when the family had gathered in the blue drawing room for musical entertainment provided by Catherine's skilled fingers upon the pianoforte. Timothy confided as they crested the small hill that revealed the lake spread before them like a mirror reflecting the azure sky, that his mama used to say that spring at Thornfield was like watching the world remember how to be beautiful. She had told him that God painted pictures there just for them to enjoy. The lake was indeed a picture worthy of divine artistry, surrounded by ancient willows whose new green branches trailed gracefully in the gentle breeze, dotted with the promised daffodils that nodded in golden profusion along its banks, and crossed by an elegant stone bridge that spoke of Georgian sensibilities applied to landscape design. It presented a scene of such peaceful beauty that Arabella felt some of the tension she carried in her shoulders begin to ease. They had been exploring the water's edge for perhaps an hour, Timothy collecting smooth stones while Arabella sketched the swans that had indeed returned to their favored nesting spot, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention toward the bridle path that skirted the lake's western shore. The rider who appeared was immediately recognizable despite the distance. Sebastian's tall figure was unmistakable even when mounted upon Tempest, the powerful black stallion that was his particular favorite among the estate's impressive stable. Arabella's first instinct was to gather Timothy and withdraw to a respectful distance, maintaining the invisible boundaries that separated the family from their employees, even in casual encounters. However, Timothy had no such inhibitions about approaching his father, and before she could suggest discretion, the boy was calling out and waving with the enthusiastic abandon of childhood affection. Sebastian's response to his son's greeting revealed something of the internal struggle that seemed to characterize his every interaction with the normal pleasures of life. His face, which had been set in the harsh lines that had become habitual during his morning rides, softened immediately upon seeing Timothy, but there was something almost painful in the way he seemed to force himself to return the boy's wave. As he guided Tempest toward them, Arabella had her first opportunity to observe Sebastian closely in daylight and in circumstances not governed by the formal constraints of indoor encounters. The morning light revealed details that the shadows of the house had previously concealed. The fine lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and inner torment, the careful way he held himself in the saddle that suggested physical discomfort despite his apparent skill, and most surprisingly, the way his gaze seemed drawn to the peaceful scene they had created by the lake with something approaching hunger. His greeting was courteous as he dismounted, his voice carrying the cultured tones of his upbringing despite the roughness that seemed to plague it these days. He trusted, he said, that Timothy had been behaving himself and not leading Miss Fairfax into any adventures that might concern his grandmother. Arabella replied with appropriate respect, offering the sort of slight curtsy that acknowledged his rank while maintaining her dignity, that Master Timothy had been the perfect gentleman and an excellent companion for their morning's explorations. There was something in Sebastian's expression as he looked at his son, pride mixed with a sorrow so profound it seemed almost physical, that made Arabella's heart contract with unwilling sympathy. Whatever demons drove this man to seek destruction in London's gaming hells and drinking establishments, his love for his child was evident and uncompromised. Sebastian inquired about the treasures they had discovered that morning, his manner with the boy revealing glimpses of the man he might have been under different circumstances. Timothy launched into an enthusiastic description of their morning's activities, producing his collection of stones and detailing Arabella's sketches with the sort of detailed enthusiasm that only children possess. As the boy chattered, Sebastian's attention gradually shifted to include Arabella in his consideration, and she found herself the subject of a scrutiny that was both unsettling and oddly thrilling. Timothy continued his narrative, explaining that Miss Fairfax had been teaching him about perspective in drawing. She had told him that understanding how things appeared from different positions helped one see truth more clearly. Sebastian's response was directed toward Arabella, and there was something in his tone that suggested he found the observation relevant to matters beyond artistic instruction. He wondered aloud what she saw from her particular perspective that morning. The question, innocent enough on its surface, seemed loaded with meanings that propriety warned her not to explore. Arabella felt her cheeks warm as she considered her response, aware that something in the quality of his attention had shifted from polite employer interest to something altogether more personal. She replied carefully that she saw a beautiful morning made more pleasant by good company and peaceful surroundings, though her voice carried a slight tremor that she hoped was not too apparent. Timothy interjected, apparently sensing nothing unusual in the atmosphere between the adults, wondering whether his papa would like to see Miss Fairfax's sketches. She drew even better than Mama had, he declared, though he probably should not say such things. The mention of his dead wife seemed to recall Sebastian to himself and to the impropriety of whatever had been developing between them. His expression shuddered, becoming once again the carefully controlled mask that he presented to the world, and Arabella felt a curious mixture of relief and disappointment at the return of formal distance. Yet something had shifted in that brief moment of connection, something that would prove impossible to ignore, despite the social conventions that demanded they pretend it had never occurred. As Sebastian remounted Tempest and continued his ride, leaving them to their peaceful morning by the lake, Arabella found herself troubled by thoughts that had no place in the mind of a governess. The man who had looked at her with such intensity, who had seemed to drink in the sight of her and Timothy enjoying the simple pleasure of a spring morning, bore little resemblance to the dissipated rake whose reputation had preceded him to Thornfield Manor. For just a moment, she had glimpsed the person he might have been, or perhaps still was, beneath the protective layers of cynicism and self-destruction. Timothy, oblivious to the undercurrents that had charged their encounter, returned to his stone collecting with undiminished enthusiasm. He chattered about his father's skill as a horseman and his hope that they might ride together soon. Innocent observations that only served to emphasize the tragedy of a family fractured by loss and grief. As they made their way back to the house in time for Timothy's midday meal, Arabella found herself thinking not of lesson plans or household routines, but of the way Sebastian's eyes had seemed to search her face, as though looking for something he had lost and feared he might never find again. The encounter by the lake had lasted perhaps 15 minutes, yet it had altered something fundamental in Arabella's perception of her situation at Thornfield Manor. She could no longer think of Sebastian simply as the troubled master of the house, whose reputation required her to maintain careful distance. Against all wisdom and propriety, she had begun to see him as a man in need of exactly the sort of peace and gentle companionship that she and Timothy had been enjoying on that bright spring morning. Such thoughts were dangerous for a woman in her position, she knew. Governesses, who entertained romantic notions about their employers, found themselves without positions and without references, cast adrift in a world that offered few opportunities for fallen women to redeem themselves. Yet as she supervised Timothy's meal and guided him through his afternoon lessons, Arabella could not banish the memory of those few moments when Sebastian's careful composure had slipped, revealing the pain and longing that lay beneath his cultivated indifference. The spring afternoon passed in its usual routine, but something had changed at Thornfield Manor. In the space of a single morning encounter, the careful boundaries that had defined Arabella's life there had begun to blur, setting in motion events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, sacrifice, and the possibility of redemption. In the days following their encounter by the lake, a subtle alteration occurred in the rhythm of life at Thornfield Manor, so gradual and seemingly insignificant that anyone observing from the outside might have dismissed it as mere coincidence. Yet Arabella, whose position required her to be acutely aware of the household's patterns and moods, could not ignore the fact that Sebastian's presence had become noticeably more frequent in the areas of the house where she and Timothy conducted their daily activities. Where once he had been a wraith-like figure glimpsed only in passing, moving through the manor's corridors with the determined purpose of one avoiding unwanted encounters, he now seemed to appear with surprising regularity in the library when Arabella brought Timothy for their afternoon reading sessions. His explanations for these appearances were always perfectly reasonable. He required a particular volume for his correspondence, or wished to review estate documents that were kept in the library's secure cabinet, or needed to consult the maps that were housed in the collection inherited from his grandfather's travels. Mrs. Thornfield, whose sharp intelligence missed very little that occurred within her household, observed these developments with the sort of careful attention that suggested she understood their significance even if she chose not to comment directly upon them. During their regular afternoon conversations over tea, she began to make casual references to her son's improved spirits and his apparent renewed interest in the estate's management. Observations delivered with the neutral tone of one who wished to encourage positive developments without appearing to meddle in their natural progression. Timothy, with the unconscious wisdom of childhood, seemed to accept his father's increased presence as a natural and welcome development. The boy would greet Sebastian's appearances in the library with unguarded pleasure, eagerly sharing whatever lesson or discovery had occupied their morning hours. These innocent interactions provided a natural bridge for conversations that might otherwise have been constrained by the formal requirements of their respective positions. It was through Timothy's enthusiastic narratives that Sebastian learned of their botanical expeditions through the estate's grounds, their attempts to sketch the architectural details of the manor's various outbuildings, and their exploration of the historical volumes that documented Thornfield's place in Yorkshire's development through the centuries. Each revelation seemed to spark a genuine interest that surprised Arabella with its depth and sincerity. One afternoon in late April, as spring warmth finally banished the last traces of winter's grip upon the countryside, Sebastian made an observation that seemed to mark a significant departure from their previous careful formality. Timothy had been describing their morning's discovery of a family of foxes that had taken up residence in the old gamekeeper's cottage, and Sebastian listened with the sort of focused attention that suggested genuine engagement rather than mere parental duty. When Timothy finished his account, Sebastian turned to Arabella with what might have been the beginning of a smile, remarking that she seemed to possess an remarkable talent for discovering the hidden treasures that Thornfield offered to those with eyes to see them. The comment, delivered in a tone that suggested layers of meaning beyond its surface courtesy, brought a flush to Arabella's cheeks that she hoped might be attributed to the warmth of the fire before which they sat. Her response, carefully modulated to maintain appropriate boundaries while acknowledging his kindness, was that the estate itself made such discoveries inevitable for anyone willing to explore its beauties with proper attention. Timothy's natural curiosity and enthusiasm made every expedition an adventure, she added, glancing toward the boy with genuine affection. Sebastian's gaze followed hers to his son, and for a moment his expression revealed the complex mixture of love, pride, and profound sadness that Timothy's presence invariably evoked in him. The boy was growing so quickly, he observed, and displayed such intelligence and good nature that his mother would have been immensely proud of the young gentleman he was becoming. The mention of Catherine, rather than creating the usual tension that references to his late wife typically produced, seemed in this instance to generate a different sort of emotional response. Perhaps it was the peaceful domestic scene they presented, or the evidence of Timothy's thriving under Arabella's care. But Sebastian's expression suggested gratitude rather than the usual pain that accompanied memories of his loss. Arabella, recognizing the significance of this moment, responded with gentle sincerity that Timothy spoke of his mother often, and with such love that Lady Catherine's spirit seemed very much alive within these walls. The boy's affectionate memories and his father's evident devotion ensured that she would never be truly absent from the family that had loved her so deeply. The conversation that followed marked a turning point in their relationship, though it maintained scrupulous respect for the proprieties that governed their respective positions. Sebastian began to share memories of Catherine that painted a picture of a woman whose intelligence and gentle nature had made her an ideal companion for a man of his temperament. These revelations, offered tentatively at first, but with growing confidence as Arabella received them with appropriate sympathy, suggested that he had found in her a listener who could appreciate both his loss and his determination to honor his wife's memory through proper care of their son. As these encounters became more frequent, Arabella found herself facing a dilemma that challenged every assumption she had made about her future. The man who spent these peaceful afternoons in the library, discussing Timothy's progress and sharing carefully chosen memories of happier times, bore little resemblance to the notorious rake whose reputation had made accepting the position at Thornfield such a calculated risk. This Sebastian possessed depths of feeling and intelligence that his public behavior seemed designed to conceal. His observations about Timothy's education revealed a man who valued learning and moral development above the fashionable accomplishments that occupied most of his peers. His questions about her own background, posed with delicate tact that never crossed the boundaries of propriety, suggested genuine interest in her as a person rather than merely as an employee. Yet Arabella remained acutely aware that the man who spent these afternoon hours in pleasant domestic conversation was the same one who mounted Tempest each evening and rode off to whatever diversions awaited him in the wider world. The sounds of his late-night returns, often accompanied by evidence of activities that respectable society could not countenance, served as sharp reminders that any feelings she might be developing were both inappropriate and potentially dangerous. Mrs. Thornfield's observations during this period suggested that she too was aware of the delicate situation that was developing. Her comments about Sebastian's improved spirits were accompanied by gentle warnings about the fragility of such progress and the importance of not placing too much faith in changes that might prove temporary. These cautions, delivered with the loving concern of a mother who had watched her son struggle with his demons for too long, served to remind Arabella of the precarious nature of her position. The servants, too, seemed aware that something had shifted within the household's dynamics. Mrs. Palmer made casual remarks about his lordship's improved temper and his renewed interest in estate matters, observations that suggested the entire household was holding its breath in hope that the master might finally be finding his way back from the dark path he had been walking since his return from the war. As May arrived with its promise of summer warmth and the full flowering of Thornfield's magnificent gardens, Arabella found herself caught between hope and prudence, between the growing evidence that Sebastian's interest in her was more than merely professional and the knowledge that acknowledging such interest could destroy the security she had worked so hard to establish. The situation was further complicated by her own evolving feelings toward the man who had begun to occupy far too much of her thoughts. Despite every rational consideration that argued against it, she could no longer deny that she had begun to care for Sebastian Thornfield in ways that transcended the appropriate concern of an employee for her employer's welfare. The glimpses she had been granted of the man beneath the scandalous reputation revealed someone worthy of the sort of deep affection that she had never expected to feel again after her father's death. Sebastian's evident love for his son, his moments of genuine warmth and intelligence, and the occasional flashes of humor that suggested he had not always been the grave and troubled figure he now presented to the world, all combined to create a picture of someone who might yet be capable of the happiness that seemed so conspicuously absent from his current existence. Yet even as these feelings developed, Arabella remained conscious of the vast gulf that separated them in terms of social position, wealth, and expectations. She was a governess, dependent upon her position for survival and with no prospects beyond the charity of those who might employ her skills. He was a peer of the realm, master of extensive properties, and heir to a name that commanded respect despite his recent troubles. The growing tension between her professional obligations and her personal feelings created a constant undercurrent of anxiety that began to affect her sleep and her ability to maintain the serene composure that her position required. She found herself watching for Sebastian's appearances with an anticipation that had nothing to do with Timothy's welfare and everything to do with her own increasingly complicated emotional state. As spring progressed toward summer, it became clear that the careful equilibrium she had established at Thornfield Manor was shifting in ways that would soon require acknowledgement and resolution. The dance of resistance that she and Sebastian had been performing, circling around their growing attraction while maintaining the facades required by propriety and prudence, could not continue indefinitely without something giving way to the mounting pressure of emotions that demanded expression. The evening of June the 21st arrived with the sort of golden warmth that made Yorkshire seem the most beautiful county in all of England. The summer solstice had blessed Thornfield Manor with a day of perfect weather that had drawn the entire household out of doors to appreciate the gardens in their full glory. Timothy had spent the afternoon helping the gardeners tend to the rose garden, his enthusiasm for the task providing entertainment for the staff and genuine assistance in the lighter duties that his small hands could manage. As the sun began its leisurely descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns, Arabella found herself alone in the rose garden, having sent Timothy inside to prepare for his evening meal. The peace of the moment, enhanced by the perfume of hundreds of blooming roses and the gentle hum of bees going about their ancient business, provided a welcome respite from the emotional turmoil that had been plaguing her thoughts for weeks. She had positioned herself on the stone bench that occupied the garden's center, a book of poetry lying forgotten in her lap as she allowed herself the luxury of simply existing in the present moment without the constant awareness of duty and propriety that usually governed her every action. The approaching twilight painted the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to have been chosen specifically to complement the garden's carefully planned color scheme. It was in this state of peaceful meditation that Sebastian discovered her, appearing at the garden's entrance with the sort of quiet approach that suggested he had not wished to disturb whatever private moment he had observed from the house. His presence, which she sensed before she saw him, sent a familiar flutter of awareness through her system that she had long since ceased attempting to deny or control. He paused at the garden's edge as though seeking permission to enter her temporary sanctuary, and she found herself nodding a welcome before her more cautious instincts could assert themselves. The impropriety of being alone with him in such circumstances was obvious, yet the peaceful beauty of the evening seemed to have suspended the usual rules that governed their interactions. Sebastian approached with the careful movements of one who understood the delicacy of the situation, settling himself on the bench at a distance that maintained propriety while allowing for the sort of conversation that their previous encounters had made increasingly natural. His evening clothes, unlike the disheveled garments in which she so often glimpsed him during his returns from London, were impeccably tailored and suggested that he had spent the day at home rather than pursuing his usual diversions. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, both apparently content to appreciate the garden's beauty without the need for conversation. The shared quiet felt remarkably comfortable, as though they had been friends for years rather than employer and employee who had only recently begun to acknowledge each other as individuals worthy of personal consideration. When Sebastian finally spoke, his voice carried a reflective quality that suggested the peace of the moment had affected him as profoundly as it had her. He observed that Catherine had planned this garden during the first year of their marriage, spending countless hours with the head gardener to ensure that it would provide beauty and fragrance throughout the growing season. Every plant had been chosen with care, every pathway designed to offer new perspectives as one moved through the space. Arabella responded that Lady Catherine had possessed exceptional taste and vision, evidenced not only in the garden's current beauty, but in the way it seemed to invite contemplation and peaceful reflection. The design suggested someone who understood that gardens should nurture the spirit as well as please the eye. Sebastian's expression, as he considered her observation, revealed a mixture of gratitude and something approaching surprise, as though he had not expected anyone to understand or appreciate the deeper qualities that had made Catherine such a remarkable woman. His response suggested that her ability to see beyond surface appearances, to recognize the thoughtfulness and care that Catherine had brought to every aspect of her life at Thornfield, was both unexpected and deeply meaningful to him. The conversation that followed marked a significant departure from their previous carefully neutral exchanges. Sebastian began to speak of Catherine not as the idealized figure that grief often creates, but as the complex and admirable woman she had actually been. His memories painted a picture of someone who had possessed both intelligence and kindness, someone who had seen potential in Thornfield Manor and its master that others had perhaps overlooked. Arabella found herself sharing her own observations about the evidence of Catherine's influence that remained visible throughout the house, from the choice of books in the library to the arrangement of rooms that seemed designed to encourage family life rather than formal entertainment. These details, she suggested carefully, spoke of someone who had understood that a house became a home through the accumulation of thoughtful choices and loving attention. As they talked, something fundamental began to shift in the atmosphere between them. The growing shadows and the intensifying fragrance of the roses seemed to create a sort of enchantment that made ordinary conversation feel charged with deeper meaning. Sebastian's manner lost the careful control that usually characterized his interactions with her, revealing glimpses of the passionate and articulate man he had once been. Arabella, responding to this change, found herself speaking with a freedom and openness that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Her observations about Thornfield, about Timothy, and about the evidence she had observed of Sebastian's better nature emerged without the usual careful editing that her position required. The moment when their hands accidentally brushed as Sebastian reached to retrieve her book of poetry, which had slipped from her lap during their conversation, sent a shock of awareness through both of them that made the careful pretense of mere employer-employee relationship impossible to maintain. The touch, innocent though it was, seemed to crystallize weeks of growing attraction and emotional connection into something that demanded acknowledgement. Sebastian's response to this moment of contact revealed the depth of his own struggle with feelings that honor and propriety demanded he suppress. His eyes, meeting hers in the fading light, held an expression of longing so intense that it seemed to bypass all rational thought and speak directly to her heart. Yet even as the moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and desire, both seemed to recognize the danger of what was developing. Sebastian withdrew his hand, as though burned, the careful mask of polite distance reasserting itself with visible effort. Arabella, equally shaken by the intensity of her response to his touch, struggled to maintain the composure that her position required while dealing with emotions that threatened to overwhelm her completely. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken acknowledgments and carefully suppressed longings. Both seemed to understand that they had approached a boundary that, once crossed, would fundamentally alter their relationship in ways that neither could fully control or predict. Sebastian was the first to speak, his voice carrying a roughness that suggested the effort required to maintain appropriate distance. He remarked that the evening had grown quite late and that Timothy would undoubtedly be wondering about Miss Fairfax's whereabouts. His words, though perfectly proper, carried an undercurrent of regret that suggested he was, as reluctant as she, to end this moment of unprecedented intimacy. Arabella agreed with similar reluctance, rising from the bench with movements that felt strangely disconnected from her conscious will. The book of poetry, now returned to her hands, seemed to carry the memory of his touch, making her acutely aware of every place their fingers had made contact. As they walked back toward the house together, maintaining the proper distance that convention required while being intensely aware of each other's presence, both seemed to understand that something irreversible had occurred in the rose garden. The careful equilibrium they had maintained for months had shifted, creating new possibilities and new dangers that would require careful navigation in the days and weeks to come. Sebastian's departure from her at the house's entrance was marked by a moment of hesitation that suggested he too was struggling with the implications of what had passed between them. His goodnight, delivered with perfect courtesy but carrying undertones that spoke of suppressed emotion, left Arabella standing alone in the entrance hall, with her heart racing and her mind churning with thoughts and feelings she had never expected to experience. The evening had altered everything, while changing nothing that could be acknowledged in the light of day. Tomorrow would bring the usual routines and the familiar requirements of propriety and professional distance. Yet both Sebastian and Arabella would carry the memory of this moment of connection, this glimpse of what might be possible between them if circumstances were different, as they attempted to navigate the increasingly complex emotional landscape that their growing feelings had created. As Arabella made her way to her quarters, she found herself caught between exhilaration and despair, between the joy of discovering that her feelings were reciprocated and the knowledge that acknowledging such feelings could destroy everything she had worked to build at Thornfield Manor. The night ahead promised little rest as she struggled to reconcile her heart's desires with the practical realities that governed her existence. Act 5. The Great Misunderstanding. The first sign that the fragile peace of Thornfield Manor was about to be shattered came in the form of an unexpected visitor on a gray morning in early July. Lord Pemberton's arrival, announced by the urgent clattering of hooves on the gravel drive and the sort of imperious demands that suggested a man accustomed to immediate attention, sent ripples of tension through the household that reached even the secluded nursery where Arabella was conducting Timothy's morning lessons. Mrs. Palmer's appearance at the nursery door, her usually composed features marked by obvious distress, provided the first indication that the visitor's business was of a serious nature. His lordship, she informed Arabella, with the sort of careful discretion that servants employed when discussing matters that might affect their employment, had arrived demanding immediate conference with Master Sebastian regarding certain urgent business matters that could not be delayed. Arabella's request for clarification regarding the morning's schedule was met with Mrs. Palmer's observation that it would perhaps be wise to keep young Master Timothy occupied with quiet indoor activities until the nature of Lord Pemberton's business could be determined. The housekeeper's manner suggested that she feared the conversation taking place in the library might be both lengthy and unpleasant. The sounds that began to emanate from the library within the hour confirmed Mrs. Palmer's concerns. Raised voices, though the specific words remained indistinct, carried clearly enough through the manor's corridors to suggest that Lord Pemberton's visit was not of a social nature. Timothy, sensitive to the household's changed atmosphere in the way that children often are, became increasingly restless and difficult to engage with his usual lessons. Mrs. Thornfield's arrival at the nursery shortly before noon provided both clarification and cause for additional concern. Her expression, carefully controlled but betraying signs of significant distress, suggested that whatever news Lord Pemberton had brought was of the sort that might fundamentally alter the family's circumstances. She informed Arabella that Sebastian's immediate presence was required in London to address certain business matters that had suddenly become urgent. The journey would likely require several weeks, during which time the manor would operate under her direction, and Timothy's routine should continue without alteration. However, she added with the sort of careful emphasis that suggested deeper meaning, it would be wise for everyone in the household to conduct themselves with particular discretion until the current difficulties could be resolved. The specific nature of these difficulties became clearer when Lord Pemberton departed that afternoon, his manner suggesting grim satisfaction rather than the frustration that might have been expected from an unsuccessful conference. Sebastian's appearance at dinner that evening, the first time he had joined the family for a meal in weeks, revealed the toll that the day's events had taken upon him. His face, already marked by the excesses that had characterized his recent years, appeared haggard in a way that suggested shock and despair beyond his usual melancholy. His interaction with Timothy, though maintaining the loving attention that characterized his relationship with his son, carried an undercurrent of something approaching desperation, as though he were memorizing details of a scene he might not experience again for some time. Mrs. Thornfield's explanation, delivered with the sort of careful neutrality that suggested she was protecting Timothy from adult concerns he was too young to understand, was that Sebastian's business in London was related to estate matters that required immediate personal attention. However, the glances exchanged between mother and son suggested that the reality was far more serious than this benign description implied. It was only after Timothy had been settled for the night that Arabella learned the true scope of the crisis that had descended upon Thornfield Manor. Mrs. Thornfield, apparently recognizing that the governess's position within the household had evolved beyond mere employment, confided that Lord Pemberton's visit had been related to Sebastian's gambling debts, which had reached levels that threatened the estate's financial stability. The sum involved, according to Mrs. Thornfield's careful revelation, was substantial enough to require either immediate payment or the surrender of properties that had been in the family for generations. Sebastian's journey to London was an attempt to negotiate terms that might preserve Thornfield Manor while satisfying the creditors who were demanding settlement of accounts that had been accumulating for months. The implications of this revelation struck Arabella with devastating clarity. If Sebastian were forced to sell major portions of the estate to satisfy his debts, the household staff would necessarily be reduced, and positions such as hers would become luxuries that a diminished establishment could not afford. More immediately troubling was the recognition that Sebastian's departure represented a retreat into the self-destructive patterns that his presence at Thornfield had seemed to be moderating. Mrs. Thornfield's additional confidence that Lord Pemberton had made certain observations about the appropriateness of current household arrangements added a personal dimension to Arabella's concerns. The implication that her growing closeness to Sebastian had not gone unnoticed by outside observers suggested that her position might be in jeopardy regardless of the estate's financial situation. The week following Sebastian's departure passed in an atmosphere of anxious waiting that affected every member of the household. Arabella maintained Timothy's usual routine with determined cheerfulness while privately wrestling with fears about both the family's future and her own. The boy's obvious distress at his father's absence, despite Mrs. Thornfield's carefully optimistic explanations, served as a constant reminder of how much their small world depended upon Sebastian's well-being and wise decisions. Mrs. Thornfield's daily letters from London provided little reassurance. Sebastian's initial attempts to negotiate reasonable terms with his creditors had been unsuccessful, leading to increasingly desperate measures that suggested the situation was deteriorating rather than improving. The possibility that Thornfield Manor itself might need to be sold or heavily mortgaged was no longer merely theoretical, but a genuine prospect that required serious consideration. It was during this period of uncertainty that Arabella received the letter that would transform her understanding of her situation at Thornfield and force her to confront truths about her own feelings that she had been carefully avoiding. The correspondence, delivered by special messenger and bearing the seal of Sebastian's London solicitor, contained information that would forever alter her perception of the past months and the relationships she had believed were developing. The letter, formal in its language but devastating in its implications, informed her that arrangements were being made for Timothy's future education and care that would not require her continued services. More specifically, it suggested that Lord Sebastian had determined that the boy's best interests would be served by removing him from Thornfield's current influences and placing him in an environment more suitable for a young gentleman of his station. The crushing realization that Sebastian viewed her presence as harmful to his son's welfare struck Arabella with a force that made breathing difficult. All her careful professional pride, all her growing belief that she had been making a meaningful contribution to Timothy's development and happiness, crumbled beneath the weight of this apparent rejection. Worse still was the implication that her own conduct had been judged inappropriate, and that her removal was necessary to protect Timothy from influences that Sebastian considered unsuitable. The growing warmth between them, which she had interpreted as evidence of mutual respect and affection, now appeared in a different light as something that Sebastian regretted and wished to end definitively. The letter's suggestion that references would be provided for future employment did little to soften the blow of learning that the life she had built at Thornfield Manor was considered expendable. The family that she had come to love, the child whose welfare had become central to her own sense of purpose, and the man whose redemption she had begun to hope she might influence, were all being taken from her by the very person whose happiness had become more important to her than her own security. Mrs. Thornfield's distress upon learning of the letter's contents suggested that she had not been consulted about these arrangements and that Sebastian's decisions were as much a surprise to his mother as they were to Arabella. However, her position as the family's dependent, regardless of her title and social connections, left her with little influence over decisions that Sebastian made regarding his household's management. The days that followed the letter's arrival passed in a haze of barely controlled emotion, as Arabella struggled to maintain her composure while preparing for a departure that seemed both inevitable and incomprehensible. Timothy's obvious confusion about the changes that were apparently pending, and his increasingly frequent questions about when his father would return, made maintaining normal routines virtually impossible. Mrs. Thornfield's attempts to provide reassurance and alternative explanations for the sudden changes did little to address the fundamental reality that Arabella's time at Thornfield Manor was ending in circumstances that left her future uncertain and her heart broken. The life she had built through months of careful work and growing emotional investment was dissolving around her, apparently at the direction of the man she had foolishly allowed herself to love. The recognition that she had indeed fallen in love with Sebastian Thornfield, despite every rational argument against such feelings, came too late to influence events, but early enough to ensure that her departure from Thornfield would carry emotional wounds that might never fully heal. The discovery that her love was not only unreciprocated, but was actually viewed as something to be eliminated from Timothy's life, completed her devastation and left her facing an uncertain future with resources that seemed pitifully inadequate to the challenges ahead. The truth, when it finally emerged, arrived not through any conscious revelation, but through the sort of chance discovery that novelists favor and life occasionally provides. 3 weeks into Sebastian's absence, as Arabella was methodically packing her modest possessions in preparation for a departure that still felt surreal, despite its apparent inevitability, Timothy made an observation that would unravel the entire web of misunderstanding that had been choking the life from Thornfield Manor. The child, who had been growing increasingly morose as the implications of the recent changes became clearer to his 7-year-old understanding, appeared at Arabella's door with tears streaming down his face and a crumpled letter clutched in his small fist. His distress was so profound that she immediately abandoned her packing to gather him into her arms, offering the comfort that had become second nature during their months together. Through his sobs, Timothy managed to explain that he had discovered the letter while playing in his father's study, where Mrs. Thornfield had given him permission to retrieve a book Sebastian had promised to read with him before his departure. The letter, which Timothy had attempted to read despite his limited literacy, contained words that had frightened him enough to seek Arabella's help in understanding their meaning. The document that Timothy presented to her with trembling hands bore the seal of Lord Pemberton and was dated the day before Sebastian's departure. The child's distress stemmed not from understanding the letter's threatening contents, but from his innocent recognition that a document bearing the name of the man who brought unhappiness to their house also contained Miss Fairfax's name in the same troubling context. As Arabella read its actual contents, the careful facade of noble concern that had disguised the true nature of recent events began to crumble, revealing a reality far more sinister than she had imagined. Lord Pemberton's letter was not the demand for debt settlement that everyone had assumed, but rather an ultimatum of a completely different nature. The disabled lord, still nursing grievances from the duel that had ended his military career, was demanding satisfaction that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with revenge, carefully planned and expertly executed. The letter made clear that Pemberton had been systematically gathering information about Sebastian's private life, using his network of connections to monitor activities at Thornfield Manor and document any behavior that might be construed as scandalous or inappropriate. The focus of his attention, as revealed in language that made Arabella's hands shake as she read, had been the relationship developing between the master of the house and his son's governess. Pemberton's threats were explicit and devastating. Unless Sebastian immediately removed the source of temptation that was corrupting his household and endangering his son's moral development, detailed accounts of their inappropriate intimacy would be shared with every important family in Yorkshire and London. The scandal would not only destroy what remained of Sebastian's reputation, but would ensure that Timothy would grow up bearing the shame of his father's latest moral failure. The letter's most crushing revelation was that Sebastian's gambling debts, while real, were manageable within the estate's resources. The financial crisis that had seemed to threaten Thornfield's survival was largely a construction designed to provide cover for the more serious threat that Pemberton's blackmail represented. Sebastian's departure for London was not an attempt to negotiate with creditors, but rather a desperate effort to find some way to satisfy Pemberton's demands without destroying the lives of the people he loved. Arabella's letter of dismissal, she now realized, had been written under duress as part of Sebastian's attempt to protect both her reputation and Timothy's future from the scandal that Pemberton was threatening to create. The cold formality of its language, which had seemed to indicate Sebastian's regret about their growing closeness, actually reflected his desperate attempt to create distance between them before Pemberton could make good on his threats. Mrs. Thornfield's arrival at the nursery, drawn by Timothy's continued sobbing, provided confirmation of Arabella's sudden understanding of recent events. The older woman's expression as she recognized the letter in Arabella's hands revealed that she too had been excluded from Sebastian's confidence, though her maternal instincts had undoubtedly sensed that his actions were motivated by protection rather than rejection. Timothy's innocent questions about why his father was sending away the best governess he had ever had, and why Lord Pemberton's visits always made everyone in the house sad and frightened, provided the final pieces of a puzzle that painted Sebastian not as the callous employer Arabella had believed him to be, but as a man trapped by circumstances that left him with no good choices. Mrs. Thornfield's explanation of Pemberton's history with their family revealed the depth of hatred that motivated his current campaign of harassment. The duel that had damaged his arm had been fought not over any genuine slight to Lady Pemberton's honor, but over Pemberton's own inappropriate advances toward Catherine, which Sebastian had publicly exposed and condemned. Pemberton's subsequent bitterness had been nurtured through years of observing Sebastian's happiness and success, waiting for an opportunity to extract the sort of revenge that would cause maximum damage. The realization that Sebastian had sacrificed his own happiness and potentially his relationship with his son in order to protect her reputation struck Arabella with a force that left her breathless. The man she had believed capable of such callous dismissal was actually demonstrating the sort of selfless love that she had never expected to encounter outside the pages of novels. Yet, understanding Sebastian's motivations did not immediately suggest solutions to the impossible situation that Pemberton had created. The threats remained real, and the damage to all their lives would be equally devastating whether Sebastian submitted to the blackmail or chose to fight against it. Arabella's departure might satisfy Pemberton's immediate demands, but it would not address the underlying hatred that motivated his actions or prevent future attempts to destroy Sebastian's peace. Mrs. Thornfield's observation that Pemberton's campaign could only succeed if its targets allowed themselves to be divided and isolated suggested a different approach to the crisis. Rather than accepting defeat and separation, she proposed, they might consider whether standing together and refusing to be intimidated might not prove more effective than the individual sacrifices that Sebastian was attempting to make. The idea that she might choose to fight for the love she had discovered rather than accepting exile as the price of respectability was both terrifying and exhilarating to Arabella. Her entire life had been built around the careful management of reputation and the avoidance of scandal. Yet the thought of losing Sebastian and Timothy without even attempting to defend their right to happiness seemed suddenly more frightening than any social consequences. Timothy's tear-stained declaration that he would rather live with disgrace than lose either his father or Miss Fairfax provided the emotional clarity that weeks of agonizing had failed to achieve. The child's innocent wisdom cut through the complex calculations of social consequence to focus on the simple truth that families belonged together regardless of what others might think or say. Mrs. Thornfield's agreement with her grandson's assessment, despite her own deep investment in social propriety and family reputation, revealed the extent to which Pemberton's threats had clarified everyone's priorities. The preservation of appearances seemed less important than the preservation of the love and happiness that had begun to heal the wounds left by war and loss. The decision to recall Sebastian from London and confront Pemberton's threats directly, rather than submitting to his demands, represented a transformation in Arabella's understanding of her own worth and agency. The governess who had accepted her dismissal as inevitable was replaced by a woman prepared to fight for the family she loved and the future she had never dared to imagine might be possible. As plans took shape for a response that would challenge Pemberton's assumptions about their weakness and isolation, Arabella discovered reservoirs of courage and determination that her previous life had never required her to access. The prospect of scandal and social ostracism remained frightening, but the alternative of losing Sebastian and Timothy had become unthinkable. The letter that would summon Sebastian home and begin their campaign to reclaim control over their own destinies was written that evening with hands that shook not from fear, but from the excitement of finally choosing love over safety, hope over resignation. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, it held possibilities that extended beyond mere survival to encompass the sort of happiness that seemed worth whatever risks might be required to achieve it. Sebastian's return to Thornfield Manor occurred under circumstances that no one could have predicted when he had departed 3 weeks earlier as a man apparently defeated by forces beyond his control. The rider who thundered up the drive on a foam-flecked horse bore little resemblance to the broken figure who had left Yorkshire in response to Lord Pemberton's ultimatum. Instead, he appeared as a man transformed by the discovery that his sacrifice had been both unnecessary and unwelcome to those he had sought to protect. Mrs. Thornfield's letter, reaching him at his London lodgings in the depths of despair over his inability to find any solution to Pemberton's threats, had provided more than mere information about recent developments at Thornfield. Her account of Timothy's discovery of the blackmail letter, Arabella's immediate understanding of the true situation, and both their refusal to accept separation as the price of avoiding scandal, had awakened something in Sebastian that had been dormant since his return from the wars. The man who had spent 2 years seeking oblivion in gaming hells and drinking establishments suddenly rediscovered the capacity for decisive action that had once made him a valuable officer in Wellington's army. The passion that had been channeled into self-destruction found new purpose in the protection of those he loved and the defeat of an enemy who had mistaken his grief-induced apathy for permanent weakness. His first stop upon returning to Yorkshire was not Thornfield Manor, but Pemberton Hall, where a confrontation 2 years in the making finally reached its inevitable conclusion. The meeting between the two men, conducted without witnesses but with consequences that would affect both their futures, resolved questions that had poisoned the peace of both their households for far too long. Sebastian's approach to this final reckoning demonstrated the strategic thinking that had served him well in military campaigns, and that he now applied to domestic warfare with equally effective results. Rather than responding to Pemberton's threats with either submission or futile rage, he had spent his weeks in London gathering information about his enemy's own vulnerabilities and preparing weapons that would prove far more devastating than anything Pemberton had assembled against him. The investigation that Sebastian had commissioned through his London connections had revealed that Lord Pemberton's disability compensation from the War Office had been obtained through fraudulent claims about the extent of his injuries. Medical evidence suggested that his arm, while damaged in their duel, had not been rendered permanently useless as he had claimed in his pension applications. More damaging still were revelations about his treatment of the tenants on his estates and his financial dealings with neighbors who had trusted his representations about various business ventures. When Sebastian confronted Pemberton with this evidence, the conversation quickly shifted from threats about Thornfield Manor to negotiations about mutual silence regarding past indiscretions. Pemberton's position as the injured party seeking justice gave way to the reality of a man whose own secrets were far more damaging than anything he had discovered about his enemy. The resolution that emerged from their meeting was both comprehensive and permanent. Pemberton agreed to cease all interference in Thornfield's affairs and to retract any statements he had made about the family's domestic arrangements. In exchange, Sebastian would maintain discretion about the information he had gathered regarding Pemberton's fraudulent pension claims and questionable business practices. Yet the victory over external threats, satisfying though it was, represented only the first step in reclaiming the happiness that had seemed lost forever. Sebastian's return to Thornfield Manor that evening brought him face to face with the more complex challenge of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by weeks of misunderstanding and unnecessary separation. His reunion with Timothy, conducted in the nursery under Arabella's carefully neutral supervision, revealed the extent to which the boy had suffered during their separation. The child's initial wariness, born of confusion about why his father had left so suddenly and why Miss Fairfax was preparing to leave as well, gradually gave way to the sort of clinging affection that spoke of genuine fear that the adults he loved might disappear again without warning. Sebastian's explanation to his son, carefully crafted to acknowledge the child's intelligence while protecting him from adult complexities he was not ready to understand, focused on the resolution of problems that had temporarily required his attention in London. The important thing, he emphasized, was that those problems had been solved and that their family could now continue the peaceful life they had been building together. Timothy's immediate question about whether Miss Fairfax would be staying at Thornfield brought the conversation to the heart of issues that required resolution between the adults. Sebastian's response that such matters needed to be discussed privately, but that he very much hoped she would choose to remain, provided the opening for conversations that had been postponed too long by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Mrs. Thornfield's tactful withdrawal with Timothy, ostensibly to supervise his delayed evening meal, left Sebastian and Arabella alone together for the first time since their encounter in the rose garden weeks earlier. The constraint that marked their initial exchanges reflected both the formal boundaries that had supposedly governed their relationship and the wealth of emotion that had accumulated during their forced separation. Sebastian's apology for the distress his apparent dismissal had caused her was delivered with a formality that barely concealed the depth of his regret and self-recrimination. His explanation of the circumstances that had forced his actions, while providing context for decisions that had seemed incomprehensibly cruel, could not entirely undo the pain that those decisions had inflicted. Arabella's response revealed both the hurt she had experienced and her growing understanding of the impossible position in which Sebastian had found himself. Her acknowledgement that his actions had been motivated by protection rather than rejection provided the foundation for rebuilding trust that had been damaged by necessary deceptions. The conversation that followed allowed both of them to address feelings and intentions that propriety and circumstances had previously required them to suppress. Sebastian's admission that his interest in her extended far beyond her professional qualifications was matched by Arabella's confession that her feelings toward him had evolved beyond anything appropriate to her position as an employee. Yet even as they acknowledged the mutual attraction that had been developing for months, practical considerations remained that could not be dismissed simply because external threats had been resolved. The vast difference in their social positions, the unconventional circumstances of their courtship, and the potential impact on Timothy of any dramatic changes in their household arrangements all required careful consideration. Sebastian's proposal, when it finally came, was delivered not with the passionate romanticism of youth, but with the mature consideration of a man who understood both the value of what he was offering and the sacrifices it might require from the woman he loved. His offer of marriage was accompanied by honest acknowledgement of his flawed character, his troubled past, and the social challenges that would face any woman who chose to link her fate with his. Arabella's acceptance, delivered with equal honesty about her own circumstances and the practical considerations that made such a union as beneficial to her as it was to him, marked the beginning of a partnership based on mutual respect and shared dedication to Timothy's welfare as much as on romantic love. The wedding that took place 6 weeks later in Blackwood Park's private chapel was conducted with the sort of quiet dignity that reflected both the couple's mature understanding of marriage's serious obligations and their determination not to provide ammunition for those who might question the appropriateness of their union. The ceremony, witnessed by Mrs. Blackwood, Timothy, and the household staff who had observed their courtship from its tentative beginnings, marked not just the joining of two lives, but the healing of a family that had been fractured by loss and misunderstanding. Mrs. Blackwood's tears during the ceremony spoke not of sadness at changes in her household, but of gratitude that her son had finally found the peace and happiness that had seemed impossible during his long struggle with grief and guilt. Her welcome of Arabella into the family carried the warmth of genuine affection rather than mere social courtesy. Timothy's obvious delight at the union that made Miss Fairfax permanently part of their family provided the final confirmation that their unconventional romance had produced the sort of stable foundation that would benefit everyone involved. The boy's innocent observation that he now had both a father and a mother who loved him equally demonstrated the healing power of love properly applied to domestic situations that had seemed hopeless. As the months passed, Blackwood Park gradually regained the atmosphere of peaceful contentment that had been missing since Catherine's death. Sebastian's transformation from tormented rake to devoted husband and father proceeded with the steady progress of genuine change rather than dramatic reformation. His wildness, channeled into productive management of the estate and tender care of his expanded family, proved that redemption was possible even for those who had seemed beyond help. Arabella's evolution from desperate governess to confident mistress of a great household demonstrated that love, properly supported by mutual respect and shared purpose, could indeed transcend the social barriers that seemed so insurmountable to those observing from outside. Her influence on both Sebastian and Timothy continued the work of healing that had begun during her first months at Blackwood Park, but now with the security and authority that marriage provided. The birth of their daughter, in the spring of 1816, marked the complete restoration of Blackwood Park as a place where love flourished and family life provided the sort of happiness that had once seemed impossible to achieve. The little girl, named Catherine, in honor of the wife whose memory would always be cherished, but who no longer cast shadows over the living, represented the future that had grown from the ashes of past sorrows. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, transforming broken souls into devoted partners, and proving that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to choose hope over despair, connection over isolation, and the uncertain future over the safety of familiar suffering.